Questions?
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Travis, and I'm actually in ethics, so this is kind of new territory for me. But I have a question about, I mean, you were kind of making this point all along, but you really pull it together strongly at the end, and so I haven't read this article that you did with your student, but it sounds like your point is basically, well, the folks who are criticizing you are saying that, you know, you're advocating spinning science, and what you're really trying to advocate is using these tools you've developed and this knowledge that we have. The only question that I have is just because I'm totally with you. You said a little bit earlier on your presentation that we should get rid of this false dichotomy between framing and information. I think that's dead on, and it seems right that framing is about communication. But that doesn't seem to me, at least not clearly, to entail that all framing is equal, or that some of it is just as good as the rest, or something like that. And so, I mean, I could imagine some people in the more sophisticated attacks on this article that you wrote, not saying something like, you know, you just shouldn't use these tools at all, but maybe we should be careful about how we use them. As long as we're entering in this normative conversation about what we should do, then maybe we should think about trying to minimize the effect that the spin part has, or something like that.
Yeah, and I know.
I think you're absolutely right, and it was, I think, a very good summary of the overall argument that I certainly presented somewhat simplistically. I think there's an important distinction that needs to be made between the content and the mode of delivery, which is a tool to an end. And maybe to just use, you know, a bit inappropriate military language, I mean, you can use, you know, some, I don't know, B-52 bomber, I can't think of what the modern version of this would be, to bring humanitarian aid to, you know, Cold War Berlin. Or you can use the same plane to drop a nuclear bomb on a city, right? The problem with it is not the plane. The problem with it is what you put on the plane. And I would argue that for that's the way to look at framing. Framing can be used, and is actually, to just make it very bluntly, to put it very bluntly, framing is being used, and very successfully so by, you know, I mean, Frankenfood is a great example. What Frank Luntz has done for the Republicans in terms of talking about or pre-testing the message where we're no longer talking about drilling for oil, but we're talking about exploring for new energies. The death tax versus the estate tax, where every message that kind of comes out of any political campaign is pre-tested to the point where the terminology is fine to. And Bill Clinton talking about gun control, gun safety versus gun control. He stopped talking about gun control in 1996 because when I say gun control, you're thinking Second Amendment, Constitution, and ultimately Americans like that. When I say gun safety, you're thinking children, gun locks, accidents, and, you know, why not have a gun lock if some innocent children die? That makes perfect sense. So just changing the label will change your category. So what I'm thinking, what I would argue is that's the first distinction that's very important that sometimes gets overlooked, the difference between the modality that gets the point across and what the point is. And the problem that we're having with the second point in terms of saying, you know, let's try to be careful, I completely agree. The problem that we're having is that when it comes to societal debates, especially at the media level, we have no control over the frames that other people are putting out. So, and a good example, I think, was the intelligent design debate in the U.S., where, and few people know this, but the intelligent design movement and the what was it called, the Discovery Institute, I can't remember, they used the exact same PR firm that the Swiftboat veterans used to have their message pre-tested, right? It's the exact same firm. And what they came up with is teach the controversy. And teach the controversy is great because most Americans buy into that idea, saying, look, if there's a controversy between what's going on with evolution versus intelligent design, if there really is a scientific controversy, we should teach it. Our children should make up their mind, critical thinking. And so they pre-tested this message, and that's every messaging that they did came around that, you know, teach the controversy frame. So 10 years later, 5 years later, maybe not 10 years later, 5 years later, the pro-evolution side came along and said, well, now we need to start framing. Well, it's too late. It's established. And so, yes, it is important to be cautious, but it's also important to understand that the dynamics will play out if we like it or not. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think it's an ethical decision at any given moment what we want to do and how we want to get these points across. I think it's one of those areas where there is no clear answer. And I think all the issues that you raise are exactly right. But I think thinking along those two lines, meaning distinguishing between the mode of getting something there and what you're getting there, and then number two, the idea that discourse will take place and is to some degree can't be controlled, I think are kind of important points to think about as we try and reach an answer, at least on this.
So Vicki Colvin from Rice. I think that if you study emerging technologies, of course you see the patterns that emerge and how they unfold. But I also think that there are critical differences between the different ones that lead to some really different challenges and perhaps different social perceptions. So in nanotechnology, the kind of ones that I have been most aware of have been the fact that it's really been a government push, which actually distinguishes it in some ways from GMOs. It's very ambiguous. You can get a plant and extract DNA and know if you have something that's genetically modified. You can't with nano. So there are some differences there. And I wonder if you really think those are at the secondary level for some of the questions you're thinking about, or do you think from a communications perspective, some of those historical and kind of functional differences might be playing some sort of role in how the public is beginning to understand this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones that you mentioned are all correct. I think there's one other one that is critical, and that is that we didn't really have a flavor saver tomato in this particular for nano. I mean, the products that came out made a lot of sense, were non-threatening. I mean, a tomato that doesn't taste very well and lasts 4 weeks in your fridge or 8 weeks is really, there's no point to it in the first place. But for a golf club, I'm not very good at, I don't play golf, but when I do, I'm not very good. If you can give me some golf club that actually allows me to, a driver that allows me to at least not look like a complete fool, that's a real good application for me, and it's not threatening. And so I think there were different applications early on that also made a huge difference in terms of how this was accepted. And I think, and I completely agree with you, I think when it will play out even more explicitly is as we're split it. Right now, I think for a lot of people, nano is still, it's very small and it's one thing. It may be fuzzy, but it's still one thing. But I think we'll see very soon where the curing cancer nanosite will split off, and the silver nanoparticles teddy bear will be a different story. So do I want it in my children's bedroom as a silver nanoparticle, what was it, Benny the Bear, that has been pulled off the market? Maybe not, but I definitely want it in my doctor's office. And so, I think we'll see nano being, there will be different types of nanos, and then I think the whole thing will become even more complicated than everything we've talked about. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the people who make a direct analogy, and I've made analogies in some ways, but a direct analogy between GMOs, for instance, and nano, that there are just so many differences. Doesn't mean though that there are not lessons to be learned from parts of it. And I saw this one article that said, look, it's all different, and I disagree. But if somebody wrote an article that said it's all the same, I would also disagree. I think there are bits and pieces that are good lessons, and there are bits and pieces that are critical differences.
I may have misunderstood one of your earlier slides. Did you say that you have data that show that the more people learn, or the more they are aware of nano, that the more likely they are to approve of it or to support?
At the bivariate level. I just showed you that one slide that says the more aware we're overall more supportive of it. Which is really, I just showed that as kind of a setup. I wouldn't treat that as a major finding.
No. It's somewhat in contrast to what's his name, Hamlet, Pat Hamlet, who has found that the more in some of these consensus programs that they've done, that the more people have learned, the more likely they are to raise these vexing ethical kinds of questions about distributive justice and privacy and other you might think of as non-technical kinds of risk dimensions associated with it. So I was just... I
think there are two things about this. One, I think it may not always be at odds. Thinking about it in a more complex fashion may not necessarily translate into more negative attitudes. And actually, some of Dominique Brassard's work at Wisconsin, she's done work on the link between literacy and attitudes, right? So and there are different schools of thought. Some people think there's a positive link. Some people think maybe a negative link. And what a lot of her work shows, it really depends. So learning more for a community activist who goes out to one of these meetings and already has a bit of a problem with government regulations, maybe with GMOs and so on, and then